Welcome to the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. I'm Beatrice Chestnut,
And I'm Uranio Pais.
and today we are talking about shadows.
Right, and this is the first of 4 episodes on a series that we decided to do. We are going to talk about shadows from 2 different perspectives. One is more individual, and the other one is more collective. But we'll split these 2 sets of episodes on first talking about the 3 instincts: self-press, social, and sexual, and their respective shadows, and then body types 8, 9, and 1. This is what we are going to do today for the more individual shadows. Then on episode 2, we are going to talk about individual shadows for heart types 2, 3, and 4, and head types 5, 6, and 7. Then on episode 3, we're going to talk about collective shadows for the 3 instincts and the body types. And finally, on episode 4, we're going to talk about collective shadows for heart types and head types. And when we say collective shadows, we mean collective shadows for all of us coming from each of those points. But we'll explain that when we get to the collective shadows. Today, it's time for individual shadows.
Yes, and I love this topic when it comes to the Enneagram because I think one of the things the Enneagram is particularly um, powerful uh, around is shadows. I once heard a an amazing talk by Richard Rohr. Many people listening to this may have heard of Richard Rohr. He's a Franciscan priest and really an amazing author and teacher when it comes to Christianity and all kinds of things. But he has also written and talked about the Enneagram, and I saw him give a talk once where he talked about the wheel of fortune in the Enneagram, and about how, especially in America and maybe to some degree in the West, we think about we're good at talking about the ascent, being successful, the conscious sort of striving for a better life, things like that. But he said we don't have very many things in our culture that help us understand the descent. And the Wheel of Fortune kind of teaches us that we go up and we go down. There are upsides and downsides to everything. And the Enneagram really helps us see and understand the descent. It helps us understand blind spots. It helps us understand what's in the shadow of the ego. And the ego being what we see and know of ourselves, the kind of executive functioning of our personality, but all light casts a shadow. So there are things that we focus our attention on that the Enneagram helps us understand, especially with respect to different types. But then it also helps us understand what we don't see, what we don't pay attention to, what we don't want to pay attention to. And of course, the shadow is a concept that most people understand, but Carl Jung talked a lot about it. And the shadow is that part of ourselves that we typically don't want to own or even be aware of. And I'll maybe say a few quotes about the shadow just by way of definition. But anything else you would want to say about the shadow? I kind of use blind spots and shadow interchangeably, but of course, I think the shadow refers to sort of all of that aspect of a person or a culture or anything really that is not seen, is relegated to unconsciousness. But what would you add before I say a bit more in terms of defining shadow?
Well, just that in my view, blind spots are like things we are not yet seeing, but when we do, it's sort of easy to keep seeing them and we don't have as much resistance, while shadows are harder for us to get in touch with because, they deconstruct us more when we do. And also, they are harder things to acknowledge, as you said. But I'm curious about your codes.
Yes, I um I think there's a lot of interesting quotes that can help us understand what shadow is. So, this one is some of them are pretty basic, like here's a quote from Robert A. Johnson, who is a Jungian author. He wrote a great book called Owning Your Own Shadow. And what he said is the shadow is that part of us we fail to see or know. Carl Jung at one point is quoted saying, "The shadow is simply the whole unconscious." So that part of ourselves that remains in our unawareness that we tend to not be conscious of. Carl Jung also said, "There is no light without shadow, and no psychic wholeness without imperfection." He also has a very famous quote, and this is really important: "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Right? So when we're not aware of aspects of ourselves, the tricky part is those aspects of ourselves continue to have an effect on how we behave in the world, how we show up in the world, how we perceive things in the world. E.M. Forster said, "We cast a shadow on something wherever we stand." Charlotte Bronte said, "The shadows are as important as the light." J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of the Lord of the Rings, "You can only come to the morning through the shadows." Um, I like this quote from Gloria Steinem: "The truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off." Often, it's really important to say, we don't see the shadow, those parts of ourselves that we unconsciously or automatically see as unacceptable or shameful or embarrassing. That's often aspects of ourselves that are in the shadow or just things we're not aware of. And when the question is, how do we get in touch with the shadow if we're not aware of what we're not aware of? And one big way that we become aware of it what is that we tend to project our shadow onto others. So projection, of course, is a defense mechanism whereby we go unconscious to something inside ourselves and see it coming, see it sort of out there in the world from coming from somewhere else or someone else. And so often what bothers us about other people, things that we don't like out there, sometimes point to parts of ourselves that are really, really important. Ram Dass said, "The shadow is the greatest teacher for how to come to the light." And I like this quote from James Baldwin: "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." Right. And I like that quote, especially because I think what the Enneagram helps us do, because it is more of an objective map of reality. It comes from a higher realm. That's what we believe anyway. And so it shows us the whole. It shows us that part of ourselves that we see, that we kind of recognize. Oh yeah, I tend to do that. I tend to do that. But then it also points to the parts of ourselves we don't see. And until we own our blind spots and our shadow parts, we can't really be all of who we are. And often what happens is by integrating those parts of ourselves that we don't like, we actually come to accept ourselves and become more whole and get more conscious, because until we integrate the shadow, we're always in a way unconsciously running away from it, like resisting being aware of things that will make us feel bad or that we won't like about ourselves or that we don't want other people to see in ourselves. And so integrating the shadow is a huge part of self-development work. And it's also what is symbolized in mythic stories that are about the archetypal hero's journey. And in some ways, doing Enneagram work is akin to what Joseph Campbell and others described as the hero's journey. And the hero's journey of archetypally, of course, is sort of the hero leaves home and goes out into the world, into the big world, to meet different challenges and trials. And one kind of testing or challenge that the hero must overcome in order to make the journey and return is facing monsters, and in the shadow, in some ways, is that archetypal facing the inner shadows.
Good summary. I want to add that in my experience with myself and others, our students, for instance, shadows get shown to us as we go higher on levels of awareness. And we had other episodes talking about levels in our CP model of levels connected to the Enneagram. So, in the beginning, we see shadows that are hard, but still in the simpler side, which I think will be the most the most of the ones we'll cover today. But but also when we go up on levels, like we get to level 4, we get in touch with deeper shadows that would be impossible to see if we were doing only psychological work. Only when we are sort of crystallized in a particular spiritual level, we get to know some shadows that are hard, really harder to own. And then finally, we get to a certain point on the path in which we are presented to some impossible shadows, like nobody can deal with them. And they are really, really, really big. And this is when we totally surrender to getting higher forms of help to come to our aid in more humility. Now, what I want to stress is that it's natural that shadows pop up when we do work. It's not only a more active investigation that brings us to them. And we need to understand that inner work is not as based in our efforts as we would like to think. Its efforts are super important, but also we get granted permission to work on things as we go. And I believe that it's, the psychologists explained that in the beginning as something like our unconscious shows us only what we are ready to work on. And all of this also to say that I particularly like the quote that says, like, the bigger the shadow, the bigger the light, and vice versa.
Yes. And of course, there are a lot of benefits to seeing your shadow and owning it, integrating it, which includes greater self acceptance, more self compassion, a greater sense of wholeness, and of course, owning more of your true self. Learning that what you thought was something you didn't want to look at, if you look at it, it actually liberates a lot of energy. People feel less anxiety and depression, more inner peace, more energy, and have better relationships when they're willing to look at those parts of themselves that they don't think are acceptable or that they would rather hide. So this is a really important thing. And of course, the Enneagram really helps us see both sides of everything, and helps us meet the shadow in a way that takes advantage of all the information we get about our Enneagram type and our subtype and our instinct, but shows us the sort of other side that we may not immediately see or want to integrate and make conscious.
Right, bringing us focus on what shadows to concentrate on, because although we may have all of them, there are some primary ones that if we work on, we'll get, faster to the other side of the shadows.
Okay, anything else by way of introduction? Or should we just talk about the shadows of the three instincts? And again, we'll be speaking at a general level here, but I think this will help people see how powerful this can be in terms of understanding the dark sides or the shadow sides of both the types and people with specific dominant instincts.
Yeah, we can start talking about the instincts.
Okay, so why don't you start us off talking about some of the shadow side of the self-preservation instinct? So here we're talking about people who were self-preservation dominant, who have that as, one way, one aspect of how they experience the world. What would you say in terms of the shadow of the of people who are dominant in self-preservation instinct?
Right. Before I say only the self pres, I want to say something about shadows of all three instincts. The instincts can be highly unconscious, as we have explained before here on the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. So, actually, if we acted out the instincts as they are, we would not play civilized. We would not be fitting into civilization because the instincts refer to the caveman and cavewoman in each of us. So one of the shadows is the shadow of the instinct itself, right? Or and how it operates. But when it comes to self-preservation instinct, maybe we can even talk about shadows of the self-preservation dominant and the self-preservation repressed instinct, talking about the whole sequence. For the dominant, it's like I want to have it all for myself first, me first, and I don't care as much about you as I may even look like, and I don't share things with you. Actually, it's secretly I'm staying with things for myself, and I'm not talking about chocolate only. So yeah, so also to stay independent of you because I don't trust you. So sometimes it's also a shadow, the distrust that self-pressed people have more than the other two subtypes of each type. Now, this independency comes also with a big belief in self-sufficiency, but the shadow is i I haven't received enough from someone, and I have cut out all possibilities of depending on someone else, and also not relying on other people. And finally, I'd say not give all of myself to the world. Like for instance, behind the difficulty that self-pressed dominants have in starting a new personal project for which they will need to quit their safe jobs. It's not only fear, it's also I am not willing to give all of myself, and I won't risk very much because I'm more interested in my part here and in playing safe. But what would you add for the self-pressed dominant before I talk a little bit about the repressed?
Yeah, I think it's definitely that sense of selfishness. And again, sometimes selfishness can be good, but in the case of self-preservation dominant, it's excessive. It's this knee-jerk kind of way of just looking at what do I need right now in a very narrow sense, going it alone, and I think also resistance to change.
Hmm. Yeah. And for the self-pressed repressed, it's like almost a suicidal impulse, putting my life and sometimes even your life at risk, right? While the self pressed dominant has something like, my life counts more than yours. Let me save mine. It's like if I'm in the jungle and there is a lion coming after you and I, all I need to do is to run more than you do, right? Is this why you are a runner, B?
I think it's one reason why I'm a runner. And let me tell you, I've thought more than once about outrunning someone who is chasing me as a runner.
I see. So the good shadow. Like another one for self-pressed repressed is to remain eternally young and irresponsible, which is a little bit of the opposite of self-pressed dominance, being all responsible, right? And then one last one for self-preservation repressed people, the shadow of uh, behind changing things all the time and not having routine is something like, I'm giving everything up. I'm not really interested in accomplishing stuff because I'm not even interested in success. So some shadows here. Anything else you would add?
No, I think that's good. What about social, the social instinct? And again, I think one last thing I will say is we always need to make sure to remember that these will vary according to the nine types. So yes, these shadows are has as we have described them, but depending on type, they may show up kind of differently.
Right. Yes, agreed. The shadows of the subtypes. But let's come back to the instincts and now talk about the social instinct. Well, the social dominant instinct wants to be the top dog. It's like to be in charge. And I do think that usually social dominants are more controlling and even more bossy. And they want to be seen and have the spotlights on them, also something about image, to be recognized and approved of by everyone. So a little bit of take all the glory for myself and be a very important person. And also, if the team fails, it's the team's fault, not my fault. Sometimes that happens with socials. And then being a very important person, the VIP, is also something very hierarchical that socials bear in their minds, but coming from the gut. Like, I need to go up the social ladder here and be, more distinguished and differentiating, also to stand above others. So I'd say it's a shadow of the superiority complex. Also to be all powerful, be the savior, the healer, the guru, or playing God.
Right. The God complex is a shadow of the social dominant.
Hmm. Yeah. Anything you would add?
Yeah, I think it's a power shadow, and also wanting to have a big impact on the collective, but not always seeing the different ways that manifests in ways that aren't so good. In terms of, like you said, being the guru, being the savior, people, social dominance, being the savior of someone in their family, or things like that, I think is really at the heart of it.
Right, and then the social repressed also has shadows. So, like, stay away from people who I believe are not trustworthy. So I don't trust as easily. And I disregard social initiatives of all kinds, even nonprofits and so forth, as always being fake and people not having good intentions. And also to go up against any attempt to build community or solve conflicts, and being very sarcastic about all of that and undermining sometimes the efforts to build more cohesion or understanding, but also undermining my own reputation at times when I get popular. Like, I see so many social repressed people when they are on the top of their image and reputation, they just do something silly that will destroy their reputation. It's very interesting for me to see that.
Yeah. Okay. So, what about the sexual instinct?
Well, I'd say that while the self-preservation instinct has somewhat of a suicidal, the self-pres repressed has the suicidal impulse, the sexual dominant has the shadow of wanting to kill the rivals, which is a little bit of the homicidal impulse. But of course, I'm not saying that most people who kill others are sexual dominants. I mean, this is a shadow, and we can control it. But rivalry, building rivalry all the time, comparing and trying to go against, and then shadow of aggression, dominating, controlling the other, and keeping you also under my wing where I can see you and protect, although that is perhaps even more social, but intensity hiding a little bit of that control drive. And also a big, big, big shadow, which is having you for me only. So possession. And I don't admit other people having you as much, or even having you a little. Finally, I like to say that sexual dominance have the predator shadow, while the sexual repressed people are the prey shadow. But what would you add?
Right. I guess I would add like a kind of focus on competition or unrestricted competition, like winning out at all costs. Um, especially winning someone over and doing anything to make that happen. Um, and yeah, the homicidal impulse, as in a crime of passion, that kind of thing, like being capable of that kind of thing, in the shadow.
Hmm. Yeah, and then the sexual repressed, getting away from you, being alone more, all those things that may happen with sexual repressed have to do with disregarding a little bit that connection that is possible to exist, and therefore denying more of me to you. So that's a shadow. And also connect, not connecting energetically with the other person, and denying that intensity that can happen between you and me, and not stepping onto their own power is another shadow for the sexual repressed. And anger, many times, not for all types, but anger tends to be more of a shadow for sexual repressed people, avoiding conflict, and as I said, the prey complex.
Almost like having a taboo on anger and even assertiveness, like losing energy when it comes time to, you know, be creative or generative or, confront something with assertiveness.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Okay, so let's talk about type 8 and the type 8 shadow.
Right, before we do, let me just say a few things about the body types shadows, because we're going to talk about eights, nines, and ones today. And so I think that body types are really controlling of their territories, and they may have shadows of doing that somewhat aggressively. Also, the shadow of anger in different forms according to each of those three types, of how anger is big and how it gets played out and it vents out in different ways. Another shadow for body types is that they're very, very judgmental, perhaps the most judgmental of all types, as the triad, the most judgmental triad, because they also think that they are owners of the truth, because they see the one way to do stuff, and therefore all the other ways, the ways of all other people, are wrong. And that includes nines. Nines just don't show that, but they they feel that in the inside. Yeah. And finally, a very interesting shadow for me for body types B, which is the fact that things that are seen usually as positive, like honor, loyalty, hide behind them or underneath them a radical stance of control. You need to be with me, and if you're not, you're my enemy. Always black and white.
Talking about eights, well, I think the first thing that's probably most obvious and most people know about is vulnerability, right? So for eights focus their attention. What gets sort of the light of their attention is power, control, strength, capability, an ability to marshal a lot of energy to meet challenges. But what remains in the shadow of type eights is any softer feelings, vulnerability. They tend to um, relegate their vulnerable feelings and anything they might see as weak into the shadow. And for eights, of course, who have done some work on themselves and have worked to be more aware, they're often very aware of their sensitivity and their vulnerable feelings. But eights, before they do that work, can really have a lot of vulnerable feelings, sensitivity in their shadow, and they can just kind of be more identified with toughness. I would say another thing is limitations. Sometimes eights kind of feel like there's no limit to what they can do. And so, what might be in the shadow is there are very human limitations. There can be ways that they make themselves sick from not really paying attention to self care needs, and which can be related to vulnerability and also its own thing. I think another thing that can be in the type 8 shadow is the impact they have on others. A lot of times that's a real blind spot for eights. They sort of have the impact they think they have or want to have, and they don't really see the impact of their energy or their presence or certain things they say. Sometimes they don't really understand how they're impacting the people around them. And then I would say another one might be seeing yourself as the owner of the truth when it comes to how things are. I think eights can tend to feel like things are the way they think they are. In other words, confusing with their truth with the objective truth. And sometimes the sense that they don't see everything maybe necessarily the way it actually is, that kind of vulnerability can also be in the shadow.
Right. Yeah, I would add just a few ones to your good list. I think that control many times is a shadow for eights because while they acknowledge most of the times that they are controlling, they don't acknowledge how controlling they are. And also aggression, because deep inside, lust, the passion of eights, has to do with destroying, prevailing. And the thing about feeling like a larger than life person has to do with being bigger than. So it has to do with imposing my strength onto the other one. And again, these are shadows, so if you're an eight, it might be difficult to see this at first, and because all shadows get hidden behind some other kinds of behaviors, like for eights, they are also generous, they are caring about others and even protectors, but even protection may be a shadow of what I've just said, feeling that I'm way better than you or I'm superior, and if I protect you, you'd better follow what I say, because if you don't, then I can change, and not protect you. So these are shadows that happen. But one last one is, I know what's right, and I'll make the wrong right. So eye for an eye, for instance, is
Right, vengeance a little bit. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so of course the passion and the fixation of all the types can be in the shadow, right? So eights may not see or experience how excessive they can be or how they can overpower or dominate a situation. And they often need feedback from other people to understand that they're getting experience that way, and they may not intend that. And that also has something to do with not always knowing their impact on other people. And again, it touches vulnerability to kind of be open to how other people experience us and hear feedback. Often that can be a source of vulnerability for all of us, but certainly the more it is typically in your shadow, the more you may need to contend with it. So, since vulnerability is one of the things in the type 8 shadow, it'll be important for eights to see all the different ways that it manifests in terms of how they are operate in the world.
Yeah, yeah. And also, eights can be very oppositional, controversial, but they not always see that. They don't see how much they go to the other side, that they are contrarians. For them, it's just, something that is intense, but they are actually, provoking people all the time, especially sexual eights, but all eights to an extent.
Right. And one thing that I'm getting reminded to say right now is when we integrate our shadow, one of the things that's an essential component of that process is experiencing any pain associated with the shadow,
Hmm.
right? So for eights on a growth path, it's going to be really important for them to feel those vulnerable feelings somewhere in their path of development, to feel the since maybe they were neglected or they didn't get what they needed early on. And so they had to toughen up as a coping strategy. But becoming more whole means reintegrating and re experiencing potentially the pain of the child that didn't get taken care of. And that's going to be a big part of the growth of the eight who is seeking to integrate the shadow part.
Okay. Shall we move to nines?
Well, I guess I'm one more thing I want to say is if you're an eight and you're listening to this and we've pissed you off, maybe that's something to pointing to your shadow, right? So when we talk about the shadows of the types, it makes sense if people have, reactions to what we're saying. I think that just hopefully you can look at what that means for you if that's happening. But let's talk about nines and let's piss off some nines. Talking about the shadows. Okay. Okay. So, nines. Nines, what's often in their shadow, top of the list, is anger. Right now, nines are anger types, but in the case of nines, they go unconscious to their anger because the big coping strategy of nine is to create harmony, stay connected to people. And so often, what gets relegated to the type 9 shadow is anything that might get in the way from being kind of in a harmonious connection with the people around and the environment in general. So, for instance, if the 9 gets angry, chances are that can create a conflict or disharmony. So nines go unconscious to their anger. And of course, when we're unconscious to something, it can still drive us, it can still have an impact. And often nine's anger leaks out as passive aggression. So the 9 who tells you he's going to do something and doesn't do it, or the 9 that feels angry inside but doesn't know how to express it directly, and so gets stubborn or resistant or silently resentful. So, anger and how it leaks out is passive aggression. The nine's own desires and priorities and personal agenda often get relegated to the what that 9 is individually good at or wants for themselves. Those desires can also be in the shadow. Also, the value or the positive aspects of conflict often are in the 9 shadow. And it's funny because one time I think we were doing an online course and I mentioned the positive uses of anger. And there were several, in the chat, there were several comments saying, wait a minute, can you go back? Can you say what the positive uses of anger are? And nines often don't see that there are any positive uses of anger. And so the positive use of a nine's anger, of their own individual anger, as being something that can put a stake in the ground, protect boundaries, be something that underlies your saying what's important to you. All of these things can get relegated to unconsciousness. Also, the need for healthy boundaries and the need to say no and the need for healthy separation sometimes. That because at a deeper level, nines fear separation as a core thing. Sometimes they can be unaware of some of the things like saying no or the healthy ways of creating boundaries because there's a underlying fear that if I create a healthy boundary, somehow that will turn into a more absolute or boundary or a separation from someone who is important. I also think the nine's importance in the world, positive qualities, power, can also often be in the shadow. But what would you add to that?
Well, I think you've said many good things, so I'll add just a few again. So, with this avoidance of stepping onto my own power. There is the fact that nines are bigger than other people, not more important, but bigger. It's like they can do much more than other people, and they can make a difference more than others. So it's like I am very big, but it's on my shadow. And this is why, because when we don't own and control our shadows, we go to the other side and we try to do the opposite, so that we don't see the shadow and nobody else does either. So I make myself small.
So I think you might need to explain a little bit about what you mean by nines or bigger. I don't think some people may not understand exactly what you're saying. I think it is really clear that nines sometimes make themselves unimportant, invisible, smaller than they are. But what do you mean they're bigger?
So if you're a nine, just pay attention to my questions and answer them honestly. Isn't it true that you can cope with more things than others? Isn't it true that in practice you can stand more stuff and have more energy to do stuff? Isn't it true that you deep inside know that you can, for instance, you can even kill someone being as big as you are, and this is the actual reason why you avoid conflicts. Also, don't you know that you have an immense capacity, even for inner work, and to change the world and to transform? Maybe you still don't see that, and you're still getting caught by the fixation of indolence, going the other way, exactly the opposite, and thinking less of yourself. But deep inside, you may just know that you could do a lot. And then that leads me to another shadow. There is a shadow for nines, which is an unwillingness to accomplish my big mission. So that's very sad, and as all shadows are, deeper shadows, and unwillingness to commit to a few things. And one last one is a shadow that actually my heart is shut down, because nines are not only avoiding of anger, they are not really in touch with many emotions, because all the heart went to sleep. And sometimes people don't know or don't perceive that, because nines are nice, but it's instinctual, nice, instinctive nice, and not really heartfelt, stuff. And there is some coldness as a consequence, as a shadow.
Right. Yeah. And one thing I want to point out, I was talking earlier about how we sometimes see our shadow at first in what we project onto others and what bothers us. And nines, I think, are really bothered by authoritarians or when people are overly pushy or controlling. And again, they don't like to be told what to do. They might not always say that, but they will react often. And I think it's a little bit because there's a shadow of the authoritarian in the nine, right? They aren't coming up and telling people what to do in a powerful way, even when they could or should. So they don't like authoritarians. They don't like other people who are too pushy and outspoken and maybe directive and controlling. And it's almost like they've gone to sleep to that part of themselves, but who could do that in a positive way if they do have some legitimate authority that they can bring to the world that would be useful and powerful.
Yeah, and similarly, I think that nines usually get very critical of other people who show off, because deep inside they would like to, and they want to shine brighter, but that's very shadowy.
Right. And I want to say something about eights that I didn't say in the same respect, which is eights sometimes judge people they see as weak And often that is a reflection of the shadow, that anything they may feel that may feel vulnerable or soft or able to be hurt, sensitive, that's their own way of sort of making sure those parts of themselves stay unconscious. That it's that attitude that it's unacceptable to be that way, when actually, when eights integrate that soft part of themselves, their vulnerabilities, they're willing to be open about their vulnerabilities, that's when they actually really grow, and they complement their natural strength and power with an ability to be soft and sensitive and vulnerable in a way that acts as a beautiful balancing out. Because often, when eights are at their most powerful is when they're expressing vulnerability under, in a conscious way.
Right. So one of the ways to not be in touch with a shadow is to project them onto someone else.
Yes. Yes. When we have contempt for other people's weakness, that can be a way of denying our own weakness, which is what eights do. So let's move on to type one and talk about the shadow of one. Should I start?
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead. Yes.
Okay. So I think, in a way that's similar but different to nines, I think anger, and what it's about, is often in the shadow for ones. Ones tend to be a little more conscious of their anger or resentment or frustrations, but they often relate more to experiencing in a conscious way sort of tamped down experiences of anger. So irritation, annoyance, those kinds of things. But really, there's more anger underneath there that ones can tend to repress. And when we repress something, that means we're relegating it unconsciously to our unconscious. Also, I would say, and I also think the kinds of things that ones get angry about, when people break the rules or don't conform to certain ideals that ones think are important. Often that's maybe because the ones want to do that themselves. Ones are tired of having to do things right and do things the right way, and would love to be worse. But I think there's a fear of disorder and chaos that often underlies the one's sense that they need to do things the right way or conform to a certain standards of behavior or perfection. And so that sense, I think part of in the shadow is a sort of chaotic impulsiveness, emotionality. And it's like there's this sense of it's not okay just to feel what you feel and express it in a raw way. So kind of raw emotions, including anger, are often under the surface, in the shadow for ones. I also think that, and how anger kind of gets channeled into self criticism and criticism of others, and the negative impacts of that can also be in the shadow. I've heard one say when they're really harsh on themselves, that they should be, because they need to be hard on themselves to keep themselves in line. And they often totally underestimate the way that actually that self-criticism keeps them trapped, in a kind of cycle of feeling bad about themselves and needing to redeem themselves through good behavior and never quite getting it right, and so needing to self-criticize, and how that self-judgment and self-criticism actually doesn't have the positive function that sometimes ones think it does. It actually has a very negative impact on themselves. Also, often ones, I think, can tend to think that they're helping others when they give them critical feedback. And I think often the intention is good, but because they're not owning their anger, and maybe they're the sources of judgment deeper down in terms of right and wrong, black and white thinking, I think sometimes the criticism that they make is experienced by others not at all as helpful, but as harsh or hurtful or other difficult things. And again, I think to the extent that we don't own our shadow, we often act out in very negative ways that does hurt people. And again, this is why I think ones can have really good conscious intentions, but sometimes be experienced as being very hurtful. I would say that another thing is the downside of the pursuit of perfection. So, how perfection is not really achievable, and the effort to make things perfect often has a lot of negative side effects, like procrastination, criticism, putting in a lot of effort that is excessive or actually counterproductive. I think sometimes ones don't see that. And then, especially their own positive qualities, their own need for pleasure and relaxation. And again, I think that might be connected to the fear, maybe another shadow element of the fear of chaos, the fear of disorder, the fear of what will happen if I just go with my impulses, or I just express my raw emotions, or I just express my need for fun and pleasure and being creative. I think all of those things can sometimes be in the shadow as well.
Mm, very good point. So, what I would add, so behind the tendency that ones have to control, I think there is a lot of aggression, just like eights or even nines, as we talked about, but it's almost like I do not want to see anything different than me. So it's a shadow of lack of respect to the different. So even minorities or other things, I don't want to go to the collective now, but I think that some ones are very much engaged with like movement of minorities and so forth, even as a reaction formation to this thing inside them of standardizing everything, which is another shadow, and uh, even exterminate everything that is not conforming to the standards, not only the rules but to standards that I consider to be better than anything else. So there is a shadow of arrogance in which the one thinks that they know better, and becoming then very opinionated. So some superiority complex that is bigger for all social dominance, but I do think it's connected to point one to a degree also. And of course, there is the shadow of the punisher, the like even the torturer, or the someone that comes from the inquisition times, something like that, but then there is something that I sometimes reflect on. Even the self punishment is interesting, and brings another shadow, like the inner critic is also a way to punish others somehow, because, or if I punish myself, because it's like I'm saying, you have all these rights and you do everything wrong, and then I'll punish myself for you to see that I am more self-critical than you are, or even thinking of punishing God for having made me, or so there are very interesting ways that shadows can operate. But finally, there is a shadow of a very, you know irresponsible person that I want to be. The inner irresponsible that ones have, with a natural willingness to be wild at times.
Yes, I like the way you use the word responsible, because ones can be responsible or over responsible and judge people who are irresponsible in whatever ways they might see that playing out. And I do think it's a big shadow of a deeper desire to want to be irresponsible and do whatever they want. That's a big shadow of like just acting on your desires and instead of controlling them. And I think anger in ones, the passion of anger is, it's a way of going against what is, or whatever's happening. And so I think when ones are seeking to integrate their shadow, it's really important for them to notice what they're critical of in others. What are you judging in that other person? And recognize that what you're judging in that person, maybe they're being excessively free, or they're, slacking on their job, or they're, taking a vacation when you think they should be working, or, whatever it is that you're judging or criticizing and seeing as wrong or going against, you're going against a certain thing that's happening. If ones can notice that and really take that as a clue to something that's true of them inside themselves that they don't want to be conscious of, I think getting in touch with the shadow can be particularly a good strategy for ones on a growth path, because whatever you're criticizing in the other, what if you took that as a clue to something you'd actually really like to be able to do yourself, such that you can take the criticism not as just an acting out of your anger, but as a clue to something that's in your shadow, that you can benefit by surfacing and even integrating in an active way, taking a vacation, being irresponsible, breaking the rules, doing whatever you think that you shouldn't do, and whatever you're judging out there.
Good points. And I think this is enough food for thought and, material to bother you if you're an 8, a 9, or a 1, as shadows should do. I just want to say, B, that I feel very proud of the students that do very hard work on our retreats on looking at and overcoming shadows. And I see how we all benefit from that and how much relief we can feel when we courageously face all of this and go to the other side. So, working on shadows potentially can bring a lot of joy after that.
Yeah. And I'm glad we're doing this series on shadows, because I think it's such a huge leverage point when people are using the Enneagram for really authentic inner work, is what's in your shadow and to what degree can you examine that and own it and integrate it, in conscious ways. I think that's a really, really important part of the growth process connected to the Enneagram, or the hero's journey.
Yeah, indeed, hero's journey.
Okay, so I think that's good for today, and we'll continue this series in the next podcast.